Good afternoon, members of the audience and special guests. Before we begin the proceedings, and on behalf of all those present, I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. I would also like to pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge of the various lands on which we work today. This session will now be recorded. We will record audio, screen share, and our presenters. We will not be recording any video or audio input from the audience. Welcome to all, UTS students, staff, and all friends of ACRI and UTS. My name is Thomas, and I'm a project and research officer at the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese study centres exist in other Australian universities. UTS ACRI, however, is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship of these countries. UTS ACRI seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. If you wanted to explore more about the Australia-China relationship, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. Today, we are joined by Professor Hugh White to discuss the current state of regional affairs 10 years on from his impactful thesis, Power Shift, Australia's future between Washington and Beijing. Are we now witnessing in 2021 the bleak future that was foreshadowed in White's analysis? Is it too late for Australia to change track? What does an alternative to White's thesis exist? And what does it all mean for Australia's future as relations between our security guarantor and most important economic partner deteriorate? UTS ACRI Director Professor James Lawrenson will moderate this in-style conversation discussion with Professor Hugh White. Audience questions are welcome at the end, so please remember to submit your questions using the Q&A tab along the bottom panel of this Zoom webinar. Now, a little bit about the speakers today. Professor Hugh White is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University in Canberra. He studies Australian foreign, strategic and defence policy and regional and global strategic issues as they affect Australia. He spent much of his career in government, including as International Relations Advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Department of Defence. He was the first director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute from 2004 to 2011. And from 2004 to 2011, he was head of the ANU's Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. His recent major publications include Power Shift, Australia's Future Between Washington and Beijing, The China Choice, Why America Should Share Power, Without America, Australia's Future in the New Asia, and How to Defend Australia. Welcome, Professor Hugh White. Professor James Lawrenson is Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at UTS. He has previously held appointments at the University of Queensland, Shandong University in China, and Shimonoseki City University in Japan. He was also president of the Chinese Economic Society of Australia from 2012 to 2014. Professor Lawrenson's academic research has been published in leading scholarly journals, including China Economic Review and China Economic Journal. Professor Lawrenson also provides regular commentary on contemporary developments in China, China's economy, and the Australia-China economic relationship. His opinion pieces have appeared in the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, Sydney Morning Herald, South China Morning Post, amongst others. I will now hand it over to Professor Lawrenson to begin the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a great shame I couldn't be with Hugh White today. Instead, I'm joining Hugh from the bedroom of my 13-year-old son. And trust me, everyone should be very grateful that I'm using a virtual background because you certainly don't want to actually see what's behind me. Hugh, your background looks more professional than mine.
Well, thank you, John. Great to be with you.
In 2010, Hugh White opened an essay, this essay, that would become a seminal contribution to Australia's strategic policy analysis and debate. He began the essay with these words. Let me quote the opening paragraph. Hugh, you probably remember this.
I do.
There is a problem with Australia's vision of its future. On the one hand, we assume that China will just keep growing indefinitely, buying more and more from our miners at higher and higher prices. On the other hand, we expect America to remain the strongest power in Asia, the region's natural leader and Australia's ultimate protector. We will have a very nice future if both of these things happen. The problem is that they cannot both happen at once, close quote. Yet our policymakers, Hugh White argued, were showing little evidence of having understood what was unfolding in the region. Partly this could be explained because the biggest powers in Asia, Japan and China, had largely accepted American primacy and leadership for the preceding 4 decades. And because we'd done so well out of the status quo, it was somewhat intoxicating to tell ourselves a story that we could just keep it all going. But if and when we did get around to thinking about these issues seriously, our leaders could foresee a future where China would no longer be happy with that status quo. The US would then face 3 options. Option A, withdrawing from Asia. Option B, coming to some deal and sharing power with China, nonetheless giving up its primacy. Or option C, staying around and competing with China head on for primacy. And in Hugh White's view, we in Australia had better aim to bring about option B, because that is likely to be the least worst option. Why not option C? Compete with China, because the cost to America would likely prove unsustainable, and in the end it might withdraw anyway, or worse, the competition for primacy could provoke a kinetic conflict, potentially even nuclear war. Hugh White, I'd better stop there and pause for a minute and ask you whether that's a fair, albeit very quick summary of the power shift thesis you wrote more than a decade ago.
Well, first, thanks, James, and your team and our participants for this session. I'm very glad to have a chance to go back over some old ground, and to say, look, yes, your summary of the argument is very fair. That's really the proposition in a nutshell.
Great. Let's get into it then, Hugh. Having brought I'm sure most of our audience have already read your thesis, but just in case there are a few out there who hadn't, I thought that was a decent way to start. Now, Hugh, my colleague and good friend, and your colleague at the ANU, Professor Jane Golly, openly describes herself as a whiteist. I have to admit that I've frequently touted your analysis too, but Hugh, I don't want this event to be a public meeting of the Hugh White fan club. So I'd actually like to begin by interrogating your thesis and putting to you some of the criticisms of the power shift thesis I've seen raised, and invite your response. After we've done that, then I think we can move on to an assessment of how things have unfolded over the last decade and where they appear headed. Does that sound like a plan to you?
Absolutely. Sounds great.
Okay, let's get started. Following the introduction of power shift, of the power shift essay, is a section titled Facing Facts. This says, let me quote you, it says, if China's power displaces America's primacy, we will have to start thinking about our place in the world all over again from the ground up. Hugh, can I ask you about this word primacy?
Yeah.
First of all, what does it mean?
Yeah.
Does it mean dominant power, or can a country be dominant but still not have primacy? The reason I ask this is I'm an economist, and yet I see even senior international relations scholars looking to me like they're arguing with each other, struggling to pin down a definition of what primacy means. On page 38 of Power Shift, you say that if the US were to treat China as an equal, this means, quote, no more lecturing China about dissidents, Tibet, or religious freedom. It will have to accept that China's international interests will legitimately differ from America's and be prepared to compromise to settle those differences amicably. Is that really what losing primacy means, that the US will just have to shut up when it comes to China?
Well, really good question, really quite an important place to start, because primacy is right at the heart of my thesis, as your preliminary sketch indicated, was that America has enjoyed what I'm calling primacy in Asia for a long time, not just primacy, but uncontested primacy for 40 years at least. And now China is contesting that, and my argument is that China wants to not just push America, not just stop American primacy, but replace it with primacy of its own. So understanding this concept is very important. What do I mean by it? Well, it's really something pretty simple. It's a situation in which one state claims and is accorded, by at least a proportion of the members of the system, a place in an international system of more than equality, a status which allows it to some extent, to a significant extent, set the terms of international relationships within that system and enforce those terms. A country that can do that will also tend to ensure that its interests, particularly its security and economic interests, are given special weight, and it will seek to ensure that no other country is exercising anything like the same kind of influence. So it's claiming a superiority, a strength of interest, and a sense of exclusiveness. Now, to just be more practical about that, the best example we have in recent history, current history, of what primacy looks like is America's position in the Western Hemisphere. For nearly 200 years, America has claimed a preeminent position in its own backyard, and that's been broadly accepted. But you could also point to what America's had in Asia. We're all very used to talking about US leadership in Asia. By primacy, in a sense, I don't really mean much more than the kind of thing that America's had. But it's also worth noting that primacy comes in different forms. There's Joseph Stalin's primacy in Eastern Europe at the height of the Cold War, very tough, rigorous hegemony enforced by military power. The US hegemony in the Western Hemisphere has been much softer than that, much gentler. And so the fact that primacy comes in different forms is a significant part of this story. The last point to make, I guess, is simply that primacy is what China wants. We can all tell that China wants something, and we'll probably come back later to exactly talk more about that, but China wants something in East Asia more than it's had before. I think primacy is what it's after. Now, that passage that you mentioned where I said, if America is prepared to relinquish primacy, it'll have to deal with China in the ways that I described. Really what I was trying to capture there was just the sense that if America steps back from primacy and seeks to develop with China a relationship of equality, it's going to be a very different relationship from the one that America's had in the past, because it is going to have to treat China as an equal. And that means that it can't expect to impose on China anything that it's not prepared for China to impose on it. That's what equality means. Now, it doesn't mean that America has to accept whatever China does, just to get to the end of your question. No, there's still some rules and constraints, but at least within the sphere in which China claims primacy, I would say within East Asia, then it's going to have a special standing, just as within the sphere that America claims primacy, in the Western Hemisphere, for example, it has a special standing. So it really means something. I mean, it's a very significant part of the way an international system might work.
Okay, so the top dog, perhaps the unassailable top dog. Let me just stick with this question of primacy for a bit, Hugh. And specifically, I want to ask you about what the US has had in strategic terms in Australia's region and what it is aiming for. Now, look, on the one hand, the Trump administration's strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific is full of the term primacy. The yes. First national security challenge in capital,
up there at the top, yeah.
That's exactly right, is, quote, how to maintain US strategic primacy in the Indo-Pacific region. It describes as a desired end state, quote, the US maintains diplomatic, economic, military preeminence in the fastest growing region in the world. So look, that does indeed sound like a strong commitment from the US to remaining the unassailable top dog, having primacy in the region. On the other hand, Hugh, I have heard some folks push back on your thesis, and they say when you're talking about primacy, you ascribe something to US intentions that simply isn't there. Let me give you one example. I'm quoting Ian Hall here, who was, I think, an old colleague of yours from the ANU, now at Griffith University. He says, quote, since the 1970s, the US has basically been an offshore balancer, except for the special case of Korea. He says its aims are limited to defend allies and deter attempts to alter the territorial status quo. Close quote. Do you buy that, Hugh, or is the US wanting much more than that?
No, I don't buy that. I've got a lot of time for Ian. He's a very fine scholar, but I disagree with his characterization of what America is doing as offshore balancing. Offshore balancing is the idea of offshore balancing borrows from the model of what Britain tried to do in relation to Europe in the 19th century, where it was quite happy for the Europeans to do all the things that Europeans used to do before they had the EU, always competing and bullying one another. And Britain stood back, wasn't allied with any of them, but was always prepared to come in if necessary in order to make sure that no one power came to preponderate. But the whole aim of British policy was to avoid any engagement. And it certainly tried to avoid any alliances until the very end of the 19th century. But America's policy in Asia has been completely different from that. It's been right in there. It's had key alliances, not just with South Korea, but with Japan. It's been the security guarantor of East Asia's most powerful state, or at least until recently, East Asia's most powerful state. It's been our security guarantor. And it's been the de facto security guarantor of every country in the region. This is much more than offshore balancing. This is onshore balancing. This is getting right in. Now, if we ask ourselves what does America want at the moment? Well, I think you can see that in two terms. The first is it wants to prevent China achieving China's objective of primacy or hegemony in East Asia. But it also, and I mean, going back to the Trump administration's document that you quoted, and I smiled when I read that, I must say, that it wants primacy. It doesn't want to just stop the Chinese dominating East Asia. It wants to dominate East Asia. And although that's not language that the Biden administration has yet brought itself to use, when you look at the kind of language it has used, I think they're just pussyfooting around it. I see no evidence that the Chinese don't really want to stop the US, get the US out of Asia. I see no evidence the US does not fully intend to preserve the kind of role it's had in Asia for so long in the past.
All right, that's a pretty clear rebuttal from you there, Hugh. I'm going to keep on with the critique, if you don't mind. This is a bit of a tough way to start off a
good way to start.
A discussion 10 years after your thesis. But here's another one, Hugh. This is one that I keep seeing coming up. I've heard people complain that Hugh White goes straight from strategic competition that it might involve some low-level tensions and frictions to nuclear war. And because of that nuclear possibility, to advocating that Australia's best course is to urge the US to relinquish its primacy. But in fact, some argue, what's more likely is a multipolar region. Indeed, to be fair to you, in Power Shift, you actually talk about a multipolar region as well, where competition results in frictions and measures that fall short of war. A distinct prospect, for example, probably a reality too, actually, in fact, is China making use of what we might call salami slicing tactics and grey zone measures, which without any pushback will allow China to get its way and in turn bring about a more illiberal order in Australia's region. So in that context, the argument goes that seeking to accommodate China would be a deficient strategy that misdiagnoses the nature of the challenge that we're facing. We're better off encouraging the US to stay, striving to build a balancing coalition that includes Japan and India, and trying to shape a regional order to one we would much more prefer, one where China doesn't get a free run. Hugh, what's wrong with that assessment? Is your analysis too binary, too stark? Or is it just that the risk of a kinetic conflict potentially ending in nuclear war is so devastating that in your view, we just can't afford to muck around and take our chances?
Yeah, look, really, really good question, James, and brings in some really important issues. So the first point I'd make is we've got to be very careful which region we're talking about. Because a lot of our discourse these days, not back when I wrote the essay, but these days, it presumes that we're dealing with a region called the Indo-Pacific, which goes all the way from, India's border with Pakistan on the one hand to the west coast of the United States, or even the east coast of the United States on the other. And that region will be multipolar, because I don't think there's any prospect of China being able to dominate India. Leaving aside what America might do, India is a very special player in this business because it's, broadly speaking, a peer competitor of China. Not there yet, but, with 1.4 billion people of its own, it's got to be on its way. But I don't think the Indo-Pacific, beloved of it is of many of my friends and colleagues and critics, I don't think that's the key focus. Our key focus is East Asia and the Western Pacific, because that's China's key focus. I don't think China really expects to be able to dominate the Indo-Pacific. but I do think it expects and desires to dominate, to establish primacy over East Asia. And so that's what we need to focus on. Now, the question then is, would it be possible to establish a multipolar order in that region? Sure it would. That's actually what I'm arguing for. But multipolar orders come in different varieties, and some are inherently peaceful and some aren't. The kind of multipolar order that the critics you're mentioning propose is what you broadly call a good old-fashioned balance of power. There's China on the one hand, and maybe it can find a few allies, although it hasn't got many of those. And the others, there's America and Japan and Australia, and maybe if we can talk them round, the Southeast Asians on the other, balancing China. That is the classic balance of power model. But as Hedley Bull, great Australian scholar, man after whom my building was named, once said very wisely, a balance of power system is not a system to avoid war, it's a system to avoid hegemony, if necessary, at the price of war. The thing about balance of power systems is that you end up going to war with them. If you look back at the history of 18th century Europe, that was a classic balance of power system. And they had a major great power war about once every 20 years. And it was a bit of a nightmare. The other kind of multipolar order is what I talk about in the essay. It's a concert, which is very different from a balance of power system, because in a balance of power system, everybody competes and they just choose teams. In a concert, the great powers in particular, the ones that are really strong enough to make a difference, agree to manage their competition in such a way that it doesn't get out of hand. Now, what I'm arguing for is building a new order in East Asia, which has that kind of balance. The trouble is that requires very big compromises by everybody, the kind of compromises that we talked about in your first question. And in the end, I haven't seen any sign that either America or China are willing to make those compromises. So while I still think it's the best outcome, I don't think we should just assume that we can get it. And if we want it, we've got to work really hard for it, which is not what we're doing at the moment. At the moment, we're sailing into a balance of power structure. Now, the last point of the question is the thing about war. So far, what we've seen in the Western Pacific is, as you say, a whole lot of sort of grey zone salami slicing. But I think we'd be very unwise to assume that that's the only risks we face. Because as all the talk about the Thucydides trap makes clear, the kind of contest we have between America and China at the moment, which is, after all, a contest between the world's two most powerful states, over which of them will be the dominant power in the world's most dynamic region. That line from the beginning of the Trump administration's document used that kind of language. That the stakes could not be higher. And these are the kind of stakes which throughout history, great powers have been willing to go to war with one another over. Now, people in, the Thucydides trap guys say this means that war is inevitable. Well, I don't think that's right. It's not inevitable, but it's a real risk. And I think if we ask ourselves, how is war avoided? How do we sort of see countries competing in the grey zone, salami slicing, but don't go to war? The answer is because one side or the other backs off. So if one side or the other backs off, fine, we'll avoid a war. But if neither side backs off, and you look at the trajectory of the escalating rivalry over the last 10 years, and indeed over the last 10 months, then you get yourself to the point you're thinking, well, if neither side backs off, then the chances of war are very real. So one of the big differences between me and a lot of other people who are looking at these questions is that I do see the risk of war not as inevitable, but as very high, much higher than others do. And I therefore think it's worth making big compromises and painful compromises in order to avoid it. And that's where a lot of the debate resides, I think.
Thanks, Hugh. It's good hearing you take on those critiques head on. I think our audience will enjoy listening to that as well. Look, I'd like to give you a bit of a break now after hitting you with 3 critiques in a row. Transition more towards talking about the developments that have unfolded since Power Shift was published. But actually, to make the transition, I actually want to play to you and our audience an interview between an edited clip between yourself and Peter Jennings of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, published published in August 2014, where in fact Jennings begins by citing what he regarded as another problem with your power shift thesis. So I'm just going to ask my ACRI colleague to play that. Our audience might just have to wait for a couple of moments.
But something that I've sort of niggled at you over a couple of years now about your line of argument is to say, as yet, we really have had no indication from China of anything other than satisfaction with the state of their bilateral relationship with Australia, notwithstanding the steps that have been taken to get us closer to the Americans through the enhanced cooperation in the North, and for that matter, the closer cooperation that we're now contemplating with the Japanese. So I'll end on this question, which is really to say, at some point, in order for your thesis to be validated, that has to change, and we have to have an angrier Beijing that really is pushing Australia on its position. When do you think that's going to happen?
I think one of the reasons why the Chinese are relatively content with the position Australia's taken is I think the successive Australian governments have actually been quite careful to manage the way they've presented their approach to these issues in such a way as to avoid irritating China too much. No, well, I'm just observing that the way Australian governments have managed to balance their position between the US and China has been to offer something to the US and then offer something to China to keep the balance. We have already, for some time, managed our relationship with the United States to take China's sensitivities into account. And we've managed our relationship with China to take US sensitivities into account. That's what it's going to be like for us.
I call that good policy.
Oh yeah, no, that is good policy. It's good policy as long as the US and China have a relationship in which that kind of accommodation is possible. The risk for us, though, is that the US-China relationship becomes more intensely adversarial, to the point where the choices we have to make are starker and starker, and eventually we end up having to choose.
Well, I've got to say, I think we can chalk that round up to Hugh White. Hugh, no one is suggesting that China is still quite happy with its relationship with Australia these days. You noted to Peter that while China hadn't become angry towards Australia, this reflected careful diplomacy on Australia's part, and also a US-China relationship where competition wasn't unbridled. When you look at dynamics since 2014, does one element stand out as having changed more decisively? For example, has the US strengthened its commitment to maintaining primacy? Has Beijing overtly increased its challenge? Or even if both of these are true, could Australia still potentially have threaded the needle with more adept diplomacy of the type that you were describing in your discussion just before?
Yeah, well, James, it's a really good question, and I haven't really seen that interview for a while, so I'm sort of amused to see it again. Yeah, look, I think right at the heart of this is that, as I predicted, the relationship between the US and China has become much more starkly adversarial, and therefore our choices have become starker. And so, to some extent, and I'll get back to that in the last part of your question in a minute, but to some extent, our predicament today is a product of a transformation of the US-China relationship. I think myself that has been primarily because of changes at the US end. I don't think China's policies changed quite sharply, its attitudes, the tone of its conduct changed, I think, quite sharply in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, 2010, which not coincidentally, I think, is the time of the global financial crisis and the, ascent of Xi Jinping to supreme leadership. But it was also the point at which I think China's both military and economic power became, in a sense, so great that it became almost impossible, at least in the Chinese view, for America to resist it. So I think a whole lot of things changed that back then, which, if you like, broke the previous mold of China's Biden-Hyde accommodating position. And then in the decade followed that, roughly, well, the time that followed that, up until I think 2017, the US sort of half recognized what the Chinese were doing, but really didn't internalize it. And so throughout the Obama administration, for example, you had this sense of rivalry. They launched the pivot, after all, in 2011. But you also had a very strong commitment to try to pretend that everything's fine that the relationship with China was going to be manageable, that we didn't have to see China as a strategic rival. And it wasn't until we got the Trump administration in and codified in the Trump administration's national security strategy of December 2017 that you had America really declare China to be a strategic rival. And of course, that then, that was at the strategic front. Of course, there was a lot of economic stuff going on at the same time. That produced a whole new dynamic in the relationship. And I think to a certain extent, Australia's predicament, our worsening relationship with China, the sense that we do now have to make that choice that Peter Jennings back then was so confident that we wouldn't have to make, that is partly a reaction, a reflection of the way in which we have just been caught between two tougher, more adversarial great power rivals. But that's only part of it. Because when you look at other countries in the region who have been in the same position, have also been trying to, walk that narrow path between America and China, they haven't had as hard a time as we have. Everyone in Asia, you could say, is trying to keep in good with the United States because they want US support so the Chinese won't be able to monster them on the one hand, and they want to keep in good with China because they want to continue to hitch their economy to the Chinese locomotive. And we're the only one that's got into as much trouble as we have. And so we could ask ourselves, what's New Zealand done differently? Or what's Singapore done differently? Or what's South Korea done differently? Or even what's Japan done differently? And so I do think it's partly external circumstances, but I think it's also our own maladroit diplomacy, which has got us into that problem. And I think behind that maladroit diplomacy are some real questions about what our underlying strategy is.
Right. You've said a couple of things, Hugh, there that I do actually want to explore more on. In particular, just then you talked about how other countries in the region had handled their own China challenge and the US-China competition. Let me follow up with a question on that exact topic. When I see analysts talking about Australia's region, I see them pointing to sets of facts that essentially confirm or validate their own hypothesis.
We all do that, mate.
That's right, if we're honest. So for example, some will point to the rise of the Quad. And you mentioned Japan before, and an increasingly assertive Japanese rhetorical position on China as evidence that Japan, India are coming around to the Australian position. Even European powers now have their own Indo-Pacific strategies. Another one of your colleagues at the ANU, Rory Medcalf, said in September 2020 that, quote, all eyes are on us and Australia has never been less alone. Close quote. Now, on the other hand, there are repeated statements from the Singaporean Prime Minister about how China's rise is a reality that must be accommodated without a view to changing China. The Indonesian Navy is undertaking joint exercises with the PLA Navy off the coast of Jakarta, and Australia is certainly an outlier in having no senior level political dialogue with China and in the range of trade punishment disruption it is being hit with. So my question for you, Hugh, is what's your assessment of where the region is at? Are there any particular data points that you find particularly instructive for discriminating between these different positions?
Yeah, okay, really good question, James. And worth making a point that right at the heart of Australian policy, such as it is, on this whole question is the idea that we can work with America and all of our regional friends and partners. And as you say, there's a lot of talk about how big that group is and how diverse and powerful that group potentially is, in order to push back effectively against China and stop it becoming too powerful. And so there's a natural tendency for people, including many of my dear close friends and colleagues, to look out there and sort of mark off on the scorecard, yes, these guys are with us and those guys are with us and these guys are with us, and look how many people are on our team, and the poor old Chinese are all alone over there on the other side of the room and nobody's going to dance with them. Well, maybe I'm less persuaded. What strikes me is that Well, and I should say that governments, successive governments, both sides of politics, have made great play of how Australia is going to work with other countries in the region and build up close regional connections. And been working hard with the Quad. They've been working hard with individually with India and Japan. There's much talk about ASEAN and so on. I personally think that there is a lot less to all of that than meets the eye. Take the Quad to start with. A big focus on the fact that we've got Japan and India and the United States and us all together seemingly coalesced around the idea of pushing back against China. But when you look at what the Quad actually delivers, you look at the sort of stuff that was talked about at their first virtual summit a few months ago. It's about vaccines, it's about cyber, it's about this, that, and the other. It's a whole lot of little stuff, none of which actually delivers anything. If I'm right about what I said in answer to one of your earlier questions, that this is a real high order power politics in which in the end war or the threat of war is going to play a critical part. And the big question is the Quad really an Asian NATO? Does it really express the willingness of those four countries to actually, if necessary, go to the mat and go to war in order to prevent China from pursuing its challenge to the US? Because it's worth bearing in mind, right at the heart of US strategy is an attempt to deter China from sustaining its challenge to US primacy by an implied, or in some cases explicit threat by the United States to push back militarily if they do. Are we really willing to support that? Is India and Japan willing to support that? I don't see any evidence of that at all. Talk is cheap, but I don't think there's anything like that kind of resolve. And I mean, one point you can make there is even if you look at Japan, which is in some ways the other country in the Western Pacific, which is most closely aligned with Australia in terms of our anxieties about China and our commitment to the United States. Had it not been for the pandemic, we would have had a major state visit by Xi Jinping to Tokyo last year. This year, the Japanese and the Chinese have still been trying to make that visit work. Now, can you imagine Australia hosting a state visit by Xi Jinping today? It's absolutely out of the question. That just tells you how differently the Japanese approach to China, how differently the Japanese are approaching China from we are. Then we look at ASEAN, and you mentioned Singapore. Lee Hsien Loong has been extremely articulate, and at times even a little bit lecturing, taking a bit after his father, and lecturing to Australia that we can't respond to China's rise by trying to keep China in a box. So we're going to have to accept that China is a great power in Asia and that it's going to have more influence, and we need to work out how to accommodate. In other words, I think he agrees with me. I don't think he'd put it that way necessarily. But I think when we actually look at what's happening in Asia, the countries of Asia are nothing like as close to us, as confident as we proclaim ourselves to be, that somehow we can push back against China's challenge and preserve US-led primacy, the US-led order, preserve American primacy as America wants to do. And, the fact is, partly because of that, we are turning to Europe. And I've just got to say, how pathetic is it that we think there's a huge deal because the British, 80 years, is it, from the Pearl Harbor and the fall of Singapore, are going to come back to Asia. I mean, give me a break. That is folly. Europe will have no strategic impact in Asia at all of any significance.
All right, no holding back there from Professor Hugh White. Hugh, I've got one more question. I can see the Q&A box filling up, but I'm just going to ask one more question. Then I'm going to go back to the Q&A, and then I'll finish off on another one on my list. So here's the final question from me, Hugh, before we go to the Q&A. And you actually mentioned this word strategy just before. I want to come back to that. Now, you argued in Power Shift that fundamentally Australia didn't have a strategy for living in a region with a more powerful China, or China's GDP. Hugh, this is something I follow closely as an economist, has doubled since then. Do we have a strategy now? Now, Foreign Minister Marise Payne says we do. Very clearly, in an address to the Australia-China Business Council a couple of weeks ago, she said, let me quote her, quote, Australia is following a clear strategy informed by clear objectives and principles. In working with China, we seek a relationship that serves the interests of both countries, in which each respects the other's interests, consistent with our values and our sovereignty, closed quote. Now, I've written for the Lowy Institute that comments like these strike me more as statements of desire rather than as plans for overcoming obstacles.
Yes.
And that is, in fact, in the words of Richard Brummelt, a leading academic on strategy, it's a hallmark of bad strategy. Now, am I being too harsh? Or perhaps, even if the government isn't willing to say it so out loud, might we fairly confidently conclude that Australia has settled on a strategy and that it's option 3 in your Power Shift 3?
Yeah.
That is, spurring the US into strategic competition with China by making it clear to Washington that we are on board and in the expectation that China is going to back down.
Yeah, look, really critical question. The first part of the answer is to say absolutely right. The kind of formulation that Maurice Payne was using there that you quoted, that's not a strategy. That is just an expression of hope, and vain hope. It's, you know, what we've got to recognise is that our preference is to preserve and perpetuate a US-led order in Asia, which China is deeply committed to overturning. So, you know, we have devoted ourselves to frustrating China in one of China's most deep-seated ambitions. And so the idea that we end up with the kind of, you know, kumbaya relationship with the Chinese that Maurice Payne postulates, well, it would be nice, but that's not going to happen. So do we have a strategy? Well, I don't think we have a strategy. If by strategy we mean a carefully a balanced and articulated set of steps to get from where we are today to where we want to be. But I think we do have a strategy if in a sense of, you know, where we think this is going, and that is, it is option C. That is, Australia has increasingly conducted itself on the basis that the US will succeed in defeating China's challenge and persuading China to accept US primacy. And in a sense, the more our relationship with China has deteriorated over the last 3 years or so, the more deeply we're committed to the idea that that China's going to fail and that America will succeed. And so, you know, that's right at the heart of it. Now, my problem with that is that I think the chances of that succeeding are very low. It's not that I wouldn't like it to succeed, to be absolutely crystal clear, and I made this crystal clear all the way back in Power Shift. I love US primacy, and I'd be much better for Australia if US primacy could be sustained forever. I just don't think that's practical politics. So what we need is to start working out what to do if we don't get what we want, and that's the challenge that we're dodging. That's the real strategic question for us.
Thanks, Hugh. Okay, let me now go to a couple of questions. They're really pouring in here. Look, I'll ask you this one first because it's such a current issue, and I imagine that many people will be interested in it. This is from Hossein Garavi. He asks, is the withdrawal from Iraq, Syria, and now Afghanistan, is that a sign that the point of focus of the current US administration is changing from a focus on the Mideast and imposing maximum pressure on Iran towards the Asia-Pacific and a more Cold War style conflict with China?
Yeah, look, so that's a really good question. And I think the answer is yes and no. It's yes to the extent that clearly the United States, having placed the Middle East right at the top of its strategic hierarchy of priorities ever since 9/11, and in some ways for a long time before that, is clearly, ever since the Obama administration, just stepping back from that. I think, you know, we're now seeing US influence in the Middle East at a lower point than it's been for a very long time. And a lot of people in Washington would say to you, and some people in Canberra would say to you, that shows that what America's doing is swinging its focus across to Asia. And therefore, it's an indication that America is taking Asia seriously. I don't draw that conclusion, because for two reasons. The first is that the nature of the resources involved are so different. You know, the Middle East is overwhelmingly a land force story. and even at its height, the commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't absorb very much of America's air and naval power. And air and naval power is what's really critical in East Asia. So I think I don't think there's as much of a straightforward trade-off as there might have been. The other reason why I don't see it in that way is that the scale of the task in East Asia is so much greater. I mean, of course, it's significant that the United States is no longer bogged down as it has been in Iraq and Afghanistan and spending $1 trillion there over a decade and so on. But the scale of the task that America has set itself as it confronts China is far, far bigger than anything it's done in the Middle East. It's absolutely vital to remember that China is the richest and therefore the most powerful adversary that the United States has ever encountered. The Soviet economy at the height of the Cold War was never more than half the size of America's. China's is the same size as America's and is heading on up faster. So China is just much more formidable. And so the idea that we can take comfort, we in Asia can take comfort from the fact that America is bugging out of the Middle East is not one that I support. I think America will be out of the Middle East. I think that's very significant. It says something important about America's global posture. But I don't think that means that we can be confident that it's going to have the resources to do what those who assume that America can prevail in Asia would like to think it will.
Thanks, Hugh. Here's a question from Glenda Corporal from the Australian, and she raises, it's interesting because this is something that you could not have foreseen when you wrote Power Shift back in 2010. It's this. She asks, how does the rise of a leader like Xi Jinping, who rose to power since you wrote your thesis, impact on how you view your thesis now? Does the rise of Xi Jinping change your reading of the region or not? I think that's a useful question to us.
Yeah, look, it's a really important question, Glenda, and thank you for it. The answer is I don't think it makes that much difference. Obviously, Xi Jinping is a very special leader with some very special weaknesses and some substantial strengths. But I think the idea that the problem we have with China today is a reflection of Xi Jinping's personality or ambitions way understates the scale of the problem. Whoever was leading China, as China overtook the United States to become the biggest power and the biggest economy in the world, was going to be leading a country that was not just in its leadership in Zhongnanhai, but out there in the streets and lanes, dissatisfied with an order in its own backyard, which saw it subordinate to American power. Any leader in China would have been seeking to transform that order and to give China a much greater say. And I think any leader in China would have been seeking to assert, or as they might say, reassert China's hegemony over its own backyard. And so, although I think the tone of which it's been done, and you might say some of the impatience with which it's been done, is down to Xi Jinping as an individual. The broad thrust, the broad drift, the scale of China's challenge, the nature of America's response, the challenges that poses to Australia, I think that would have happened anyway.
Thanks, Hugh. I do think that is a really good question because in Australia, we always hear this, China has changed, and indeed it has. But I guess your point is yes, but the question is the changes that we often talk about, such as the rise of Xi Jinping, how much do they matter for the big strategic question? And from your answer just then, it may not matter so much. Even if it wasn't Xi Jinping, it could well have been someone else, and we'd be in the same basic bind that we are now. Okay, let me ask another question. This is from Carl Hinz. This is he asks, how similar is Australia's relationship with China to Canada's? And he follows it up with this, Hugh. He says, Canada wasn't able to leverage the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations with China to improve a deteriorating relationship with China. What lessons can we learn from Canada's experience? And if I could just editorialize a little bit here, I think this is interesting because are we at a point now where sort of diplomatic tweaks can still achieve something, or are we past that point and we've got a really big fundamental problem on our hands?
Look, I'll answer your question first. I don't think this is a space for tweaks. We face a fund. I mean, as I said a minute ago, our problem with China is that our primary aim is to prevent China achieving its primary objective. So, this is no angles here. This is a really fundamental contest, and either we'll give way or China will give way, and don't like our chances of China giving way. So I think it is, it's that big. But look, and I think there are some very interesting analogies between our position and Canada's, but I think there's one huge disanalogy, and that's the Pacific Ocean. The fact is we're on this side of the Pacific and Canada's on the other side. Whatever happens, Canada will not end up in a region dominated by China, because whatever happens, China's not going to dominate the Western Hemisphere. America will dominate the Western Hemisphere. But for us, we might well end up in a hemisphere dominated by China. Or rather, we might well end up sitting on the boundary between a Chinese sphere of influence in East Asia and the Western Pacific and an Indian sphere of influence in the Indian Ocean and South Asia. But what we won't end up doing, I think, is ending up back where we want to be, in a region dominated by the United States, whereas Canada will. So although China's rise is a big deal for Canada, it poses nothing like the kind of, well, not to overstate it, existential challenge to our sense of our place in the world, to Canada, that it does to us.
Thanks, Hugh. Now, I'd now like to ask a question from my UTS colleague, Laiha Chen, and I find this one interesting, where Glenda's question was about, the specific impact of Xi Jinping. Laiha asks, it's sort of a question that relates to your way of conceiving of the international system. She says, I understand you're a realist thinker, Hugh. Just wonder, in your opinion, do you think that Australia's national identity, so this is sort of getting away from the realism, what realists usually focus on, that is being in Asia, but not of Asia, is it an obstacle for its relations with China? And also makes Australia deal with China differently compared with other Asian countries that you mentioned before, Singapore, Japan, and so on. Any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to defend myself from the charge of being a realist. I mean, I do put power right at the heart of the analysis, but that's just because I keep on fighting that it seems to get in the way of everything else, power and ambition. Well, look, I mean, it's a really important question. And it's absolutely central to this because, don't get me started, right from European settlement in 1788, we're here, we immigrants, because Anglo-Saxon maritime power, first British then American, provided the strategic setting, the power setting, in which this continent could be seized and occupied and developed and defended, and it completely framed our approach to our region. Australia has never had to deal with an Asia which has not been dominated and made safe for it by Britain or America. And the fact that it's Britain or America and not some other power is important because they are English speaking and we do share all those bonds of history, culture, tradition, et cetera, values that people keep on banging on about when they're talking up the alliances. And so it's a huge challenge for us to reimagine ourselves as a country that would live and thrive and flourish as best we can in an Asia which is not dominated by our mates. And so that is a challenge to our identity. And it's one of the reasons why this issue has been so hard for us to get our heads around. And some people find it impossible. I think one of the reasons why, as a country and the governing culture, I mean both politicians and senior bureaucrats, find it so hard to respond to all of this is they simply can't imagine what it would mean for Australia to live in an Asia which is not dominated by our mates. But we have made those big adjustments before, and I'm not so pessimistic as to think we can't find a way to make our way through in that kind of Asia. It's just going to be different, and we're going to have to make compromises. People get very scared by that. Well, live with it. We don't have much alternative.
There you go, a massive revelation in today's webinar. Hugh White pushes back on being described as a realist. I think that's the first time I've heard that one. Probably we are rapidly running out of time. I think I am going to finish off on this question, and it actually relates to the question that I was going to come back to right at the end as well. So this question is from Professor James Curran from the University of Sydney. He asks, Hugh, do you see anyone in government at the moment capable of the imaginary leap required to rethink the ways and means of alliance management with the United States, which for some time has been making it clear that it is prioritising the home front rather than being the global cop on the beat? Why is the default answer in Canberra to this conundrum always to do more, to give the US more? Why does giving more mean? What does giving more mean? And what can it realistically achieve other than narrow the room for our own maneuverability? That's a question I was going, more or less, was going to ask as well, Hugh, because it's interesting. I'm an economist, and I'm often told Australia has a big exposure to China. China's become a less reliable trading partner, so we need to diversify away from China. Yet in the strategic space, US is becoming a less reliable partner, but we need to double down and do even more. I mean, here's a quote from Alan Dupont in a Paul Kelly column last weekend. He says, Australia has to rethink its alliance relationship with the US, and the sooner the better. Paying our alliance dues with token contributions won't work anymore. If we want a security guarantee and the protection of the US nuclear umbrella, we have to pay a higher premium. That means greater burden sharing and greater US access to our defence facilities, particularly in Northern Australia. So Hugh, how would you respond to James Curran?
Well, James's question is a really a good one, of course. I mean, it is, in some ways, it's the great question. Let me start with the first bit. To be honest, I don't see anyone in government, or for that matter in the opposition, who shows signs of really having committed to the challenge that we're facing, the kind of energy and imagination and courage, for that matter, that's going to be needed. And if we compare our present crop, and James is better qualified to do this than I am, of course, because he's a real historian, but if you compare him with people like Alfred Deakin, or people like Doc Evatt, or Chifley, or for that matter, Spender, or Whitlam, or Hawke, or Keating, individuals, leaders who did help Australia to rethink their relationship with the world at times of great change, then we know what that looks like. And I don't see any of them now. And the reason why that's the case, the reason why that quote you had from my old friend and colleague Alan Dupont, and he's not the only one. The reason why people think that the only possible way to respond to what we see as the uncertainty about America's commitment to us and commitment to the region is to double down further is because they simply find it impossible to imagine that we might do anything else, because they simply cannot imagine an Australia that does not approach Asia on the basis of the support of a regionally dominated Anglo-Saxon, i.e. non-Asian power. And I think that so it's a failure of imagination. And I just think that's got to be wrong. Of course, there is some kind of future we can make for ourselves in a new age in which the United States is the dominant power, except I bet there better be, because I think our chances of the United States remaining the dominant power is low and getting lower, and partly it's getting lower because of the sort of chaos we've seen in the last 7 days. So I think that it requires an effort of the imagination, but then also it requires a commitment to leadership. Now, we saw Paul Keating in an interview in the Fin Review last weekend talking about how the great task of leadership, political leadership, is education. You've got to educate the public to what's going on and what we have to do about it. And that requires political courage. And we haven't seen much of that from either side of politics for a very long time. And that's why I think Australia is in grave danger of screwing up what is one of the most important national challenges we've ever faced. It sounds melodramatic, but it's the biggest shift in Australia's international setting since European settlement. And we're getting it wrong.
Hugh White, let's finish right there with that very strong quote. Hugh, thanks very much for your time today. Look, I'm going to throw it back to my colleague Thomas to wrap things up. I hope our audience has enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, James. I'm sure they have. Today's conversation was so interesting, and thank you, Professor White and Professor Lawrenson. Members of the audience will be sending an email to everybody here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it so that we can make sure that future UTS ACRI events are a better experience for everyone involved. If you want to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about our research, more details are available on our website at australia-china-relations.org. The discussion today is also available there. Please follow us on Twitter for the latest news at ACRI_UTS. Thanks again to our speakers, Professor White and Professor Lawrenson, and to Amy for putting this event together. See you all next time. Bye.